school thing that everybody sits on left, right, so I don't know, right politics in the room. Yeah. Law school, everybody would be sitting in the back row, thinking that you're invisible. I know that until my corporations class on the end of the semester, I guess you covered her. Had lunch with the, thank you very much, had lunch with the professor, and he goes, oh yeah, you're the guy who walks in late and wears the down vest and sits in the back with his feet up. It's like, so, well, welcome. Thank you very much for coming for our season 3. Hope you didn't miss us too much over the summertime. But we're back with a number of tutorials this year in hopefully a variety of interesting areas. As you know, this is a joint program between Wharton San Francisco and Wilson Sonsini Goodrich Rosati, our law firm. Today we're going to be talking about employment issues, leaving your employer, and also when you hire people from as you're starting your company. And our speaker is Rico Rosales, who is one of my partners at Wilson Sonsini. I'll give you a little bit more about Rico in a minute, but we're absolutely delighted to speak to us today. So, the next tutorial is pretty soon. It's October 12th, about 3 weeks away. And it's going to be another one of the sessions where we have one of the entrepreneurs speak about doing it, actually starting a business. And it's Harun Naga of Ardian, and it should be very interesting. And we're trying to mix things like the legal issues with business issues, with investments, with entrepreneurs who've actually done it, and hope you'll join us for that. And it's here. Same time, most of the sessions this year I think are going to be in San Francisco, or maybe about 2/3, 1/3. If you really don't like that, please let us know. I would love to have a few more down in Palo Alto, so we get while it's dark, or be while it's dark. You can find the tutorial online at tinyurl.com, Wharton Entrepreneurs Program Workshops, WEP Workshops. And then I'll be holding, I've got this. For those of you online, you can ask questions, and it'll come up on the screen here, and I'll relay the questions to Rico, so please participate. And then I'll be holding office hours. I think Rico may actually join me for some of it afterwards. Anything, if it's related to the topic, Rico, I'm sure be glad to talk about it. If it's not related to the topic, I'll try to handle anything about startup companies. We will be breaking whenever the space shuttle flies by outside. So that warning, but we'll be down in the faculty lounge, which if you don't know is all the way down all the way down through the dining room and to the left, and there's a sign down there. Enough of this stuff. I'd now like to introduce Rico. Rico is a partner in the Employment Law Group. In fact, one of the heads of the Employment Law Group at Wilson Sonsini Goodrich Rosati. Also, I guess you just kind of organized a employment and trade secret, and I'll let you speak on that. Rico has been doing this work for about 30 years, even though he looks so much younger than I do. And he went to Yale undergrad, Yale Law School. He's worked with a whole host of the names you recognize from Silicon Valley, Broadcom, NetApp, Google. He was telling me he worked with Google in 1998 before anyone knew anything about what is this thing, Google. And his specialty is employment issues. I'm always calling him up and saying, I've got somebody leaving a company, I've got somebody joining a company, I've got a threat letter coming in. What do I do? And Rico and his team are just fantastic at helping out. And above all, even more, my delighted senior colleague is a very close friend. So, Rico, I'll stop talking. I'll turn it over to you. And thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you this morning. I moved to the Valley in 1988 when my wife decided she wanted to go to business school and went to the Stanford Business School. And I somewhat reluctantly joined her, moving from Denver into what would become really the center of the tech universe, thereafter. And somehow we never made our way back to Denver, and it's been a good ride here in California since that period of time. I've always practiced employment law, but probably I'd say over the last 15 years or so, the practice has really moved in the direction, at least in the Silicon Valley, of basically dealing with employee talent issues. The hiring talent, dealing with talent that is leaving, and concerns about trade secrets, invention assignments, all those kinds of things, non-competes. I saw one of your next speakers on is someone who was formerly at Medtronic. Medtronic, in my world, is notorious for having very, very strong non-compete agreements that they enforce all around the country, making it very, very difficult for people who have worked at Medtronic to actually go off and do their own thing, work for competitors, etc. California is a different jurisdiction, which we'll get into in a bit, but that's a little bit about my practice. Since we're being recorded today, I won't be talking about the other 47%. I do have some comments on that, but maybe during office hours we can go over some of these. So I'd really like to hear from you as we go along today, so if you have questions, please just let me know. I do have something to get through. My wife said, how many points do you have? I said, 10. She was cut it down to 5. I still have 10. Because I'm always nervous about whether or not people are going to ask questions and stuff, but I'm happy to stop, digress, and answer any questions that you have. What I'd like to generally address is the topic of, which I see a lot of, entrepreneurs who are ready to kind of go do their own thing. Some of them are well-funded, some of them are not. They're working with existing companies, they're working with their buddies, and now want to go start their own company and want to do that in a way that is practical for them, given their stage of life and given their financial concerns and otherwise, and yet at the same time do it in a way that isn't going to encumber them and cause problems for themselves down the road as they start what I'll refer to as NewCo, right? And so I want to talk about some of the pitfalls associated with that, some of the things that you can do to minimize the headaches that are associated with getting started, because I'm on both sides of this issue essentially every day, talking to clients who are doing what I just described, and also talking with the big bad company from the entrepreneur's perspective that basically wants to say, hey, you're lifting my trade secrets. Hey, that's my idea. You're forming a company based on secrets and technology that we own. So we're going to be navigating some of that today, and so without further ado, let me go ahead and get started. My first point is making sure you actually understand whatever contract you are already under. Many of you will say, hey, I'm an at-will employee, I don't have a contract. Well, virtually every company, certainly in the technology space, will actually have you sign what's called a confidentiality agreement or a proprietary information agreement. In that agreement, which of course you did not read, are all kinds of restrictions with regard to what you can and cannot do, both during your employment and sometimes following your employment. In fact, almost always following your employment. And in order for you to actually understand the landscape on which you're going to be playing as you're considering getting going and starting the next thing, you want to understand what your obligations are to your current employer. Do you have a non-compete agreement? Most people in California do not, because by law, absent certain circumstances, non-compete agreements are not enforceable. However, some of you may have signed an agreement in connection with the acquisition of a business, in which case, oftentimes they are enforceable. So, do you have a restriction? Do you have a restriction that actually limits what you can do while you are employed by your employer with regard to the solicitation of employees, for example, with regard to invention assignments, things of that nature? Do you have obligations with regard to what you're going to need to do in terms of returning property to the company upon your departure. It's a very simple thing. Read your agreement. You may have been employed for 10 years and never read the agreement. You may not even have the agreement. It's a good thing to just actually know what agreements you've actually signed so that you can conduct yourself in a way that is consistent with that agreement and doesn't have you step into something that is as simple as a breach of contract action because you breached that agreement. There are some companies out there, for example, that say you are not to insert an external storage device under your work computer. Come on, give me a break. Who doesn't do that, right? But it's a violation of that agreement to have done that. You at least want to know whether or not something like that exists. I want to talk about something now called Labor Code 2870, but it's basically an invention assignments provision that we deal with all the time with regard to entrepreneurs. Because everybody is, I would say the majority of entrepreneurs that I talk to are currently employed and are thinking about leaving or already committed to leaving, but they need to kind of get this idea further along, maybe talk with some seed investors, etc., before they can actually leave their current job because they have financial responsibilities. In California, and this is true in virtually every jurisdiction, everything you do for your employer is your employer's. As an employer, you might totally agree with that position. That doesn't sound unreasonable, right? If you're actually working on something on company time, with company resources, supplies, and facilities, it stands to reason that maybe the employer would say, I own that, right? Well, that's the law. And in this agreement that none of you read, there's a provision that says you are actually obligated. So California says, hey, you cannot have an agreement. It's actually unenforceable to have an agreement that says that an employee must assign to the company something that the employee worked on his or her own time, with his or her own resources, supplies, etc., right? You can't own that unless it relates to something that at the time of conception, when the idea emerged, if you will, loosely speaking, it relates to the company business or something that is anticipated business by the company. Well, the smaller the company, the easier it is to define that, right? We know what our product lines are. So think about an IBM, think about an Intel, think about a Microsoft or a Google. What is their business? Right? It's expansive, right? So this provision basically says you have an obligation to assign to your employer, or the company can make you assign to the company anything that relates to its business or its anticipated business. So, and similarly, anything that results from the work that you did for your employee. Well, you say, well, what does that mean? Truth is, the law is not clear on what it means. I think what is clear is that those provisions are given a rather expansive definition. So the relate to is going to be expansive, right? How far are you going to push that? It relates to technology. It relates to web services. I don't know. But you need to be careful as you're out doing something with regard to whether or not you're tripping on this provision. And I will spend a couple of hours, half a day with an entrepreneur, whiteboarding what is it you're doing, and actually how does it relate to your company's business. And if you were sitting in the seat of the CEO, 1 second, would the CEO say, yeah, that relates to our business, that's ours, right? Put yourself in that position, because it's at least a sanity check. It may not be dispositive on that question, it's at least a sanity check. Yes, question?
What you're going over is really helpful so far. One of the tweaks I would love if got covered as you're going through these issues is independent contractor
Sure.
versus employee relationships,
Sure.
our headcount's pretty evenly divided between the two. And I can think of some areas where some of the stuff you're talking about may apply or not apply depending on which one.
Sure, so the question was, can you also contemplate basically the independent contractor relationship? And I'll deal with that here as well as in some comments I have later with regard to hiring of talent or retention of talent going forward. But I would say this, that if you are actually working as a consultant for a company that has consulted me with regard to what provisions to have in the consulting agreement, we're talking about essentially the same thing. Because from the company's perspective, it makes no sense whatsoever to actually have invention assignment provisions, et cetera, for employees and not to have it with consultants. So that the consultant is actually bound by those same types of restrictions, same obligations to assign, et cetera. Yes, question?
So another twist, let's say a company does many different things, right? And you're working on, your job description is A, but you have an idea about B, which is completely unrelated to your job description, but it is something that the company does as part of its business. Kind of where does that fall in the thing? Because it's not something that came out of your work specifically on your job.
Sure.
But it just happens to also fall under something else the company does.
Do I need to repeat the questions or?
Yes.
Okay, so the question was essentially, look, if you have a job description that says you do A, but your idea relates to topics B, C, and D, is the same restriction that I'm referring to applicable? The answer is generally, you should assume yes, right? Because, of course, you first started talking about topic B when you were in the cafeteria talking with an employee whose job description is all about topic B. And was all about talking to you about what the company intended to do with regard to topic B and how the market is huge in topic B and it makes so much total sense for the company to move in that direction, right? So that's how that connection is made. Yes, question?
Maybe I'm anticipating a later slide in your presentation, but if you could speak a little bit about what you as an employee can do to put some barrier, boundary between the company that you're working for and this other work that you'd like to do without putting a giant red stamp on your forehead that says, I'm leaving, right? And my company says, go talk to your VP if you're doing something on the side that does not relate to what you're working on. So what can you do as an employee without triggering giant red flags to help yourself without identifying yourself as
Got it. So the question is, as an employee who is actually considering departure, what can you do to mitigate the risks associated with this kind of invention and assignment situation that I'm describing? Let me give you an easy, but in most instances, impractical piece of advice. Quit and leave, right? And the reason why I say that is because this obligation that I'm generally referring to is an obligation that runs vis-a-vis the current contractor relationship or the employment relationship. It is while you are an employee or contractor that you have these duties. When you cease that relationship, the employer, unless you use trade secrets, no longer has a claim on what you are doing. And I'll get to the trade secret point in a second. So that's the easy piece of advice. The other is, it's not really clear what the law does, not entirely clear what the law does with verbiage that says that the employee is not obligated to assign anything that he or she developed on his or her own time without using the employer's equipment, supplies, facilities, or trade secrets, as we'll discuss. Are you using a company phone? Are you using a company computer? Are you using company time? Are you researching things on company time? Right? So, while there is no bright line, I guess my advice would be, look, you go to work and you're totally captivated by the idea of the next thing. You can't allow yourself to use company time, resources, etc., to work on the next thing. Because if an employer is really serious about trying to lay claim to your invention, to your idea, the employer is going to try to make some connection between what you were doing and to be able to establish that you actually have an obligation to assign to the company. So, at a minimum, it is don't use company time, resources, supplies, facilities, etc. Right? It is in the garage, the proverbial garage, that you're actually working on this idea. Right? For entrepreneurs, it's always about risk. Right? It's risk-reward generally. And you need to decide which risks you're prepared to take. It may very well be that as a practical matter, you just simply cannot quit, right? And you say, I hear you, Rico, with regard to how expansive the term relate is, right? It relates to the employer's business, right? Well, you're just going to have to take some risks. Not stupid risks, but you're taking a risk that if it's an expansive definition of relates to the employer's business or anticipated development, that someone may say, hey, that relates to, you were my employee, I don't care whether or not you were using my supplies, time, resources, etc. That's still my invention, assign it, right? And as I say, the only sure-proof way you have to kind of avoid that type of claim is to quit. Moving on quickly, I just simply say go back and read that agreement again, because some agreements actually have provisions. I would say they're generally problematic provisions that say for a 1-year period of time post-departure or a 3-year period of time post-departure, you are obligated to inform the company of any inventions that you have that relate to the business of the company, right? So in that situation, you've got a contractual provision that says, even once you quit, if you come up with any idea or business and pursue that relates to the business of the company, you've got to report it to us so we can make sure it's not ours, right? You know, that's probably a risk I'd say you can take. You know, that agreement is likely problematic. In the good state of California, it probably is not problematic in other jurisdictions, or many other jurisdictions, I'd say. Okay? Briefly, because I touched on it earlier, you can't use trade secrets of your employer. So what's a trade secret? Well, those things that are marked highly confidential, you know, in company documents that you've that you've seen floating around, business plans, marketing plans, sales plans, etc., you know, where they've actually been treated in a way that are confidential and proprietary. You know, many companies say information in, you know, your Salesforce database, etc. You know, that kind of stuff is confidential. But in generally, a trade secret is that which is kept secret and confidential, that has some value by virtue of it being secret or confidential, that the company has taken reasonable steps to protect, to ensure its secrecy. You know, those kinds of things will be considered to be trade secret, or at least an employer may say it is trade secret. Employers all the time say things that are, you know, questionable with regard to whether or not they are in fact trade secret. And you can have good intellectual arguments about whether or not something is trade secret. For example, salary information of your colleagues, talents of your colleagues, right? I mean, if you're an employer and you say, hey, those people, you know, that entrepreneur, you know, solicited my key engineering team, and in doing so, she used my trade secrets because she knew the talents of each member of the engineering team and cherry-picked. Okay? Well, is an employee's talent a trade secret? So, but usually when we're talking about trade secrets, something you would more readily understand is technology type stuff, right? You know, the particular technology that a company is using has developed, etc. Oftentimes, for example, you know, there's actually something called a negative trade secret. What not to do, right? A company has spent millions of dollars developing a product, it actually went down 6 or 7 different roads and got it wrong at great expense to the company, and then discovered the right path. What would work? Well, for you to go off to NewCo and to say, don't go down paths 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, because I know those won't work. If you're an employer, you're going to say, wait, that's trade secret information, right? Again, so general point, stay away from the use of the employer's trade secrets. Preparing to compete, and your duty of loyalty to the employer. As an employer, it sounds totally reasonable to say, when I'm paying my employee, I should be able to expect that that employee is loyal to the employer, and that they will not do anything inconsistent with that duty of loyalty to an employer, right? And that includes, by the way, says the employer, taking affirmative steps to compete with the employer, right? Again, read the things that you've signed, because in your standard code of conduct, conflict of interest policy, etc., there can be things with regard to what the company considers to be a violation of the code of ethics and its conflict of interest policy. So, what kinds of things can you do without running afoul, generally, of what is considered to be a duty of loyalty that the employee owes to the employer? Does it mean that, I can't even have this impure thought of starting my own business? No, it doesn't mean that, right? Does it mean that you can't take preliminary steps to establish NewCo? No, it doesn't mean that. You can do that. Does it mean that you can't buy supplies, such as computers or other technology that you might need to set up NewCo? No, you can do that, right? Does it mean that I can't incorporate NewCo? No, it generally doesn't mean that, right? So those kinds of things, which don't involve what I'll call active affirmative competition with the company, are generally considered to be within the realm of the doctrine of preparing to compete. And you can prepare to compete without violating your duty of loyalty. You can even buy a company. Yeah, I mean, you can, let's say your business plan was to amass sufficient resources with your friends to buy a company, which you would then take over and pursue. The actual process of raising capital, et cetera, to do that, you know, and in some cases say even the actual purchase of that company, which will then eventually compete with your employer, is permissible. But once you do it, the bell has been rung, and once you're involved with an entity that is actually competing with your employer, then you've likely crossed the line and violated your duty of loyalty. So you can't start, for example, we have this new company, and these customers that I'm presently working with would really be interested in the product that NewCo is going to be offering. You can't start soliciting those customers to switch over or to hold off on their purchasing decisions because the next big thing is about to hit the day I walk up out of my door and start NewCo, right? You know, that's a violation of your duty of loyalty to your employer. You know, as you sit here as, you know, reasonable people, you'd say, you know, that doesn't sound wrong, right? And if you were a jury, you 12, you'd say, that doesn't sound wrong. The employer is actually paying this employee. Why should it pay this employee to compete with the company, right? So beware of that pitfall. Again, read your agreements, because many times agreements, you know, will say something to the effect that, or a non-competition agreement generally, will talk about restrictions with regard to your preparing to compete, right? And then we're no longer in the realm of duty of loyalty as a matter of law. We're talking about a contract where you agree that you would not do anything while employed by your employer to prepare to compete, okay? In which case, it puts a very sharp question on, can I continue to do this without taking on too much risk, or do I actually have to move on? All right. Once you're ready to leave, my advice is to plan to do so professionally, graciously, and cleanly, okay? I get calls from companies all the time with regard to employees that have left, and things that they have done on the way out have only exacerbated the employer's concern with regard to whether or not this person is acting in an honorable fashion and can be trusted going forward. Or they've conducted themselves in a way that the employer says, I don't know, Rico, what she did made me a little bit nervous, and I think, you know, her intentions are not good. What's your advice? Well, my advice is secure the computer. Let's take a look at it. Let's take an image of it, and let's start kind of rummaging through the trash and see what's there, right? If there's anything that suggests that the employee has done something untoward. For example, sending 10 pieces of highly confidential information to her email account. For example, attaching external storage devices and doing all kinds of suspicious things at 11:59 on her last day of employment, right? If you act in a way that is professional, upfront, it will actually give your employer some comfort that you can be trusted. And remember, our jury of 12 over here is going to be looking at the employee's conduct all the way up until the time that they left and assessing whether or not that employee did something that would suggest that maybe motives were not pure. So, yeah, Kurt.
On that, you and I had a situation like this not too long ago, and maybe you could comment a little bit.
You mean that hypothetical situation?
Hypothetical situation. And also the hypothetical that anyone would attach a thumb drive to their work computer, or take something home to work on and install it with their home computer. And I think one of the things I learned from that process was you can detect whenever a thumb drive has been attached to a computer. And so what do you do as an employee, or what would you counsel somebody leaving their employer where they have, accidentally attached the thumb drive, a personal thumb drive, and or worked on stuff at home, so there might be something in the home computer. Because as you were just saying, taking a lot of steps to erase all of that stuff could be worse.
Okay, that's exactly what I was going to address here, right? Which is, the first point is, know what your obligations are to the employer in terms of returning company information. For example, we just finished revising our, what I'll call, foreign proprietary information agreement that is, used by millions in the valley, right? And in terms of beefing up what the employee's obligations are by way of returning information, because of what Herb has generally described the business about, information is stored everywhere now, right? I mean, you guys all have 5 or more thumb drives that you use, right? Because you just pick one up since you can't find your other one. You have external storage devices. You have things stored in the cloud, right? Well, the truth is, for most employers, employees have their proprietary information stored in lots of different places, including in the cloud. And when an employer is hell-bent at looking at your activities in a suspicious manner, innocent retention of company proprietary information is not perceived as being innocent. It is, aha, they have it. I knew it. Right? And go get them, Rico. Pay the bills, and I dutifully go get them. Right? and guess what? They have it everywhere. They're right. Now, proving use is a different matter, but they have it. That's usually the easiest piece. So what can you do as an entrepreneur that's thinking about this? Don't have it. Do your best to ensure that you understand what your company expects of you by way of returning information. Take the time to basically take the first steps of creating your clean room. Right? In your clean room, there will be nothing that can affect your clean room, including your current employer's proprietary information. You say, oh, but all my personal stuff is on my company laptop. Oh, I work so hard on those marketing plans or this schematic or, these things. I need to keep them. It's like, it's like your security blanket, right? They're my babies. I worked on them, right? Yeah, you worked on them for your employer, and your employer is going to say, that's mine. I paid you a ton of money, gave you a lot of equity for that. It's mine. You can't have it. You can't take it. You're obligated to return it. So, while it is very time-consuming to go through the exercise of trying to identify in good faith, and not crossing your fingers, what do you have that belongs to your employer, and return it. Say, here I've got these thumb drives. I've got all kinds of personal information on them. What do you want me to do? I'd like to retain my personal information. I'm happy to have you examine this. Or are you totally comfortable with my just simply representing to you that I'll delete whatever company information is on this? You tell me, employer. Yes, question.
What about all the information that's in your head?
All the information in your head, frontal lobotomies are not required under the law, right? It is, the law says that your experience, your skill, your knowledge belong to you, okay? Now, it makes trade secret lawsuits very interesting, right? When they say, I will grant you that this employee had nothing in hard copy, nothing that was stored electronically, etc., and that they were very dutiful and upfront in returning everything. Doesn't matter. They still used my ideas that they had stored up here, which were my ideas, that they worked on for 5 years developing for me. That's my trade secret. And then that's what the lawsuit will be about. But guess what? In that lawsuit, if you've done what I just finished describing and will continue to describe, and taken those prophylactic measures to be honorable, to be upfront, to comply with your obligations, to return everything, my jury of 12 over here is going to say, the person seemed pretty upfront. They seemed like they were pretty diligent about this. They seemed like they actually complied with their employer's directives with regard to returning every information. Sounds to me like this employer basically just wants to keep this person from using his skill or knowledge. Okay? Yes, question?
In terms of address book, you have a list
I'm sorry, can you speak up?
address book, you have a list of contacts you made, and that includes personal contact as well as professional contacts.
Yeah, I would say most employers, because they themselves, executives, et cetera, want to view their contact database as essentially being theirs, which has been compiled and assimilated over years of experience at various companies, right? We'll say, fine, you can take your contacts. However, my advice to you is that you tell the employer, you're cool with my taking my contacts, right? And if not, I'm happy to sit down with you and basically identify those contacts that are definitely not company information. But again, it's one of those things that if you want to look squeaky clean, you even do that. Now, I personally, especially in the Silicon Valley, don't think that a jury would get really worked up about an employee keeping a contact list. And that is particularly the case since, with the advent of Salesforce and various other, data management systems that, that's where the real information is kept, and it's not so much the contact that's on the name, on the proverbial contact card, right?
One
Okay.
more question.
Yes.
So sometimes what happens that employee walks into a company and they bring their own set of contacts and customers. So when they leave out, does those customer and contacts become property of the company that they just want, or?
So the question is, when an employee arrives at a new company with the, with contact information that they had at their prior company, does the new employer essentially permissibly lay claim to that information? Let me just answer that briefly because I want to stick to the kind of getting started topic as opposed to general mobility. But I think that the answer is no. I think there needs to be some connection between the contact and what the employee has actually done for the employer, right? Now, by the way, think of what your former employer says with regard to who owns that information. Okay, the easiest cases for me when I'm doing these litigation battles are basically that when the employee just did massive copying of what's on their computer, in the night before or the week before they left, or sent tons of information to their personal email account. That stuff, guys, just cannot be erased by and large, right? The only way you erase it is by doing something even more stupid, like running some kind of software program that wipes out your hard drive, right? Because now, for example, one of my favorite cases is, where they ran a software program called Evidence Destroyer. Right? It was free. It was free. You got it all. You were able to download it and run it, but I was able to use the fact that they ran Evidence Destroyer, right before they left, right? The employer is not going to like you basically torching their laptop, and the information that was secured there, and is going to assume the worst, right? Because they'll just figure you were up to no good and tried to basically hide your tracks, right? And you say, yes, but that's where I kept all my porn. That's where I kept my, financial information, etc. So I didn't want anybody to see that, right? Sorry. Tell it to the jury, right? That was the reason why you torched your company's computer, right? Instead, work with the company, and to get rid of the information in a way that the company is going to respect. Again, we talked about the cloud. Make sure that, you think about whether or not you've stored any company information there. And again, the best thing is to simply, hey, company, what do you want me to do? I mean, I can, I'm happy to sit with you and literally go through and delete things in a way that satisfies you, but I'm perfectly prepared to give you my representation that I've done all of this, and then do it. Because to make that statement and to not do it, just simply shows that you're a liar, can't be trusted unless you missed one thing, but deleted everything else. In general, you want some kind of paper trail or something that can kind of demonstrate that you checked in with the employer, confirmed that you returned everything, and check with them as to whether or not they had any questions. Again, touching on the duty of loyalty business, you shouldn't be soliciting your colleagues to come and join you at NewCo, right? Because you think that they would be a really great way to hit the ground running, right? Because you know how good they are, right? The duty of loyalty, it is not a duty of loyalty for you to say that you're going to go start your own company. It is a breach of the duty of loyalty to say, I'm going to go start my own company. How would you like to get in on the ground floor and be employee number 2, 3, 4, 5, right? That's solicitation. And usually your employer has a contractual provision in their agreement saying you can't do that, right? Have a clear ending date and start date at your, if you're joining UCO, you shouldn't be what we used to call moonlighting, right? There and with your new employer. It just simply confuses the issue. To the extent possible, have a clean ending date so that you're in a position to say, from that point forward, I no longer have the duty of loyalty to the employer. I was not two-timing, right? And potentially infecting UCO's IP with your current employer's IP because you were basically working there while you had these obligations to your former employer. Cool. Yes, question.
So just a quick question. So is it under your duty or anything? Let's say
I'm sorry.
during your exit interview, for example, are you obligated to tell your employee, hey, I'm starting a company and this is what the company's doing?
Okay, good.
Just to show you that it's not.
Good point. And my next point was simply cooperate during the exit interview.
Okay.
All right. Most good employers, small companies don't do this religiously. They're kind of like not used. They don't have that kind of infrastructure. The big companies, HP, IBM, bigger companies, they actually see the exit interview as a very valuable part of the process, right? For a number of different reasons, right? Do they have problems with managers? Was there something that the company, especially when you're losing valuable talent, right? Is there something they can learn that minimizes the likelihood that they lose valuable employees, right? So they will go through the exit interview. But another value of the exit interview is to actually make sure that the departing employee knows what his or her obligations are upon departure, including those things that we just discussed, right? You do understand that you have a lot of confidential information in your head and possibly on paper, right? We expect you to comply with the obligation of this agreement that you never read, 14 pages, but here it is, as a reminder, not to use our confidential information in your subsequent employment. You have these obligations to return information, et cetera, right? So they remind you of that. But because you are resigning just 3 days after your close friend resigned, the employer is saying, oh, by the way, your close friend resigned, left, and the CEO is really upset about it, right? And now, the day before you resigned, another employee resigned. And with you, because you guys are all so clever, 5 resigned at the same time, right? All in the same work group, right? And the employer's now really steamed at employee number 1, because employee number 1, of course, is violating their agreement not to solicit employees, right? And may have even violated that agreement while working, thanks to the employer, right? So they, of course, ask you, to your question, are you going to go work with Jim? Right? You are not obligated to answer that question. If you're going to choose not to answer that question, the correct answer is probably something along the lines of, I'm sorry, I'm really not comfortable responding to that, in which case you've already answered the question, right? Or you can just simply say, yes, I am. Well, what are you going to be doing there? I'm sorry, I'm not really going to talk about that. And, you don't have to say that. If you want to say, I'm going to do sales, I'm going to do product development, that's fine. If they start delving into, well, what exactly is the product, and searching for information, that you don't have to answer. But, again, when we're talking about our hypothetical jury and what the employee did on his or her way out, and did they act honorably, professionally, graciously, etc., well, the employee was forthright with his or her employer on the way out was not deceptive. They didn't have to get into the details of NewCo. They told them they were going to go work for Jim. That was enough. They didn't lie about it, right? So that would generally be my advice. You don't have to, but in general, I would say go ahead and respond, and don't do anything that makes you look like really suspicious. In that exit interview, before we move on, is most employers don't do this, but sometimes they will want you to sign something on the way out. Well, let me say this. Most employers will want you to sign something on the way out that just simply says, you understand your obligations under your proprietary information agreement and agree to abide by those terms, right? Sophisticated companies will oftentimes put something before you that says, you have trade secrets in the following 25 different areas, right? Acknowledge that, right? Because they want to do two things. One, remind you that you actually have trade secrets in this area. Two, have you understand that they're going to be looking very carefully to see whether you're working with trade secrets in those areas, right? And that's a good employer, by the way, that is very careful about that, as opposed to just simply saying, acknowledge that you have confidential information. Well, yeah, I understand that. Because you already signed that document that said you were going to be given, and you're not going to really be able to disprove the idea that you have confidential information. I guarantee you, no one in this room, given your skill set, education, etc., is going to work for an employer and not be given confidential information of their employer. You're all going to have it. You may not view it that way because it's not the crown jewels or anything like that, but your employer is going to look at it as you had our confidential information. Okay, let me segue. Yes, question.
Two questions. If, say, you and two of your buddies leave at the same time, and you found a company, who solicited whom? How do you establish that? Second question: if let's say some of my buddies went and started a company, and I want to join them, and I approach them as opposed to they approaching me, is that still solicitation?
Okay, so the question is essentially what constitutes solicitation? When have you violated an agreement? Briefly speaking, I just kind of think of it in terms of, a bell, a doorbell. Basically, who rang the doorbell? Was it NewCo rang your doorbell and said, do you want to come work? Or did you ring NewCo's doorbell and say, can I join you? Right? Lots of employers have really ridiculous non-solicitation agreements, which in some states are actually enforceable, but in California generally would not be. Right? I'm not saying non-solicits are not enforceable. I think there's a question as to how enforceable they are. But a non-solicit agreement that says, thou shalt not encourage, entice, make attractive, whatever, right? I don't know, or recruit, right? Really, you can't interview somebody even though they came and rang your doorbell? I don't think so. I really think the operative issue is who initiated? Who initiated that discussion? Now, that having been said, if you're bound by a non-solicitation agreement, you can't say, for those of you in the room, you can appreciate this, but say, I'm working at NewCo now. How great a company, wink, wink, right? I think anybody would love working at NewCo, right? All right, now you're starting to get into the area of, was that a solicitation? And most people would probably say, yeah, it probably was. Okay, got to move on. When you start NewCo, you got to make sure to protect your own IP, right? What we see all the time is a proverbial 3 or 4 friends from business school getting together to start the new business, right? And what we see, which is usually how it presents itself, is the fallout of that group of 4, and now 1 or 2 have left, right? But we had this company. Right, well, what did you do to protect your IP? Remember that agreement that we've been talking about that you signed with your former employer? What is NewCo doing to protect its IP? What is NewCo doing to ensure that the great idea that you guys are spending massive amounts of time on to develop is actually going to be owned by NewCo? What are you doing to make sure that that information is not on the laptop, the personal laptop of the employee, right? Because it's all great when you all have a great idea and want to work together and isn't this going to be fun and we're all going to be rich. But when it blows up and when there's a parting of the ways, the 3 that remains are going to want to say, that's our information. You can't take that idea, right? Well, what did you do to actually make sure that they couldn't? When there's Series A financings, it is not unusual to have to go back to the founders and have them sign a proprietary information agreement, right? They've made every employee since sign, but the founders never did, right? And before we're talking to a VC or anybody else that's going to be investing in the company, they darn well want to make sure that all the IP is the company's IP, right? And they're going to want assignments and all of that kind of stuff to make sure that that's the case. So I would generally say, make sure to prioritize that if you can. It's interesting because I'm talking about this situation in the context of, what I'll generally call the bring your own device to work movement, right? Where companies just say, hey, here's $1,500 that we're going to contribute to your own device. Go buy your own device. Well, sounds good. How great, right? Company doesn't have the overhead associated with all of that kind of stuff like that. What about all the information that's on the device? Right? I just finished talking to you about all the problems that causes when someone leaves, and now you're saying, here's $1,500, go buy your own device. It's yours. The employer has no rights to it unless the employer has actually taken steps to somehow afford it some rights. So you got to think through those issues. I think I've already talked about being careful when hiring your former employees, and I'll just refer to those comments earlier about who's the initiator. Make sure you understand what your contractual obligations are. Don't take information with you that actually can be called a trade secret, because now even if you don't have a non-solicitation agreement, maybe you're actually using trade secret information to solicit. So the proverbial open question, but one hotly debated, is if you're a manager and you actually take a sheet of information that has all of the employees' salaries, stock grants, etc., compiled in that way, is that trade secret information? I think it's a bad, whether or not it's trade secret, I would just simply say it's a bad idea to have that information. That belongs to the company. Last issue, be careful how you classify your employees, your talent, and how you compensate them. Generally speaking, we're talking about, is somebody an employee or is somebody a consultant / independent contractor, right? And there's all kinds of tests with regard to what constitutes an independent contractor. But the proverbial independent contractor is somebody that is perhaps working for multiple entities, doing things on his or her own with his or her own equipment, etc., right? And can generally control their activities. The more control there is by the employer, by the company, the greater the likelihood that there's actually going to be an employment relationship. So with the employment relationship comes all kinds of obligations, like paying taxes on the employees, right? You know, you've got tax obligations, you know, and the feds and state government don't like it when you have employees and you're not paying taxes on them, like Social Security and FICA and you know, the Medicare stuff and all the other tax obligations that the state and feds impose on you. Workers' compensation. Like what happens when an employee gets injured on the job? Right? Well, that's when they go to the state agency, I was injured on the job. And you say, no, they were a consultant. Look, right here, they have an agreement. It says I'm a consultant. And they say, sorry, we don't really look at the agreement. We look at what's actually happened to see whether or not there's an employee relationship or a consultant relationship. And, of course, if this person is working tons of overtime and all kinds of things like that as an employee, they get overtime, right? And so those things really start to add up in terms of potential exposure. So it's nice to say, and we not infrequently hear this from our clients, we don't have any employees. Okay, how many work with your venture? Well, we're up to about 33 now. No employees, wow, very impressive. You know, you gotta worry about that situation because all it tells the potential funder is, huge contingent liability here with regard to whether or not we have obligations on the wage front, et cetera, for all those people that were treated as consultants and not employees. Okay, again, the proverbial, give me 1 second, the proverbial group of 4 that goes off and say, all right, we're all going to own X% of the company, right? We agreed. We're having beer. We shook hands. Everybody was going to own 10% of the company. And we agreed there's going to be no dilution, right? Great. Then they go off, and of course there's a parting of the ways. They say, I own 10% of the company. We agreed. And you can't dilute me. Guess what? We're on the eve of the Series A financing. You know, the VCs want the cap table. You know, and here's someone saying, I own 10%, remember? I left you a year ago, but I own 10%, and I can't be diluted. Right? You got to be clear on what the compensation arrangements are, what the equity arrangements are, and don't mess around and have side deals. Do not have deferred compensation things. We won't be paid. We're all employees. I'm executive vice president of sales, but we're deferring compensation until the first funding event, right? Sorry, you got all kinds of wage and hour issues there when you make those kinds of arrangements. You're going to work for minimum wage or something along those lines, which again, I understand the practicalities associated with that, which is, we have no money, Rico, what is it you don't understand about this? We have no money, we can't pay anybody, etc. Right? We're all volunteers, okay, fine, I understand. But remember that volunteer of yours is claiming that when there's a financing event, you owe them a huge slug of money, and they own 10% of the company. So you better be clear as to what the compensation and equity arrangements were. Kurt, you had a question?
I bet you read my mind.
Okay, yes, in the back.
As far as compensation, when somebody walks away from a company, sometimes there are issues with money that's owed, bonuses and so forth. How would you sort of deal with those issues?
Not in this talk. The question is, how do you deal with issues when you're leaving your company, for example, where you actually have rights to certain compensation from an employer upon your departure? I guess I simply say that, again, to the extent that possible, try to confirm and have a clear understanding as to what those obligations are and whether those obligations are actually vested, right? So, for example, you mentioned bonus. A bonus plan, if written, will likely be very clear as to when you've actually earned the bonus. Some bonus plans may very well say something to the effect that you know, the amount isn't earned until these three things happen. And under no circumstances will a bonus be earned after the termination of employment. Right? So you just want to be clear on what those rights are. But once it's vested, once it's earned, then the law kicks in and says, sorry, you can't deprive somebody of something that has been earned. Okay? Paying in stock, you know, no wages, just paying somebody in stock. Again, they have to be paid minimum wage. They have to be paid compensation. The state authorities, federal authorities will not view stock as satisfying the employer's obligation to pay its employees. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions in the remaining time. Any other? Yes?
Can you get the advice of someone from work who's like a designer or something like that on your project without it becoming work-related?
So the question is, can you consult or get the advice of one of your colleagues at work with regard to the new enterprise that you're pursuing, you know, without that becoming a problem? So again, let's go back to that formulation of something that you did on your own time, with your own resources, supplies, etc., that doesn't relate to the business of the company, right? Loosely speaking, or anticipated development. Well, are you going to the colleague that you want advice from because they actually work in this particular area with the company, right? And in that sense, is it probable that the employer or the company will say, well, this relates to the company's business. That's why you talk to this person. And oh, by the way, you talk to them on my time. I'm not paying this employee, or you for that matter, to be talking about your new venture on company time. You've now clouded the issue with regard to whether or not your pursuit is done entirely on your own time, with your own resources, supplies, etc., and which does not relate to the business of the company or result from something that you worked on at the company. Yes, question?
How do you define, being on company time? I mean, all of us, a lot of us are basically exempt. We do check, email, for work, at home. So
the question is, how do what constitutes company time? It's a good question. It's a thorny issue, and it's kind of like this is the California Labor Code. This stuff has been around. These kinds of rules have been around for decades, right? And in some ways, do not contemplate today's workforce and work habits at all, right? Think about the virtual employee, right? The situation you discussed, which is, hey, I'm always working, right? I mean, the CEO's emailing me, or colleagues are emailing me any time of the day. Am I ever on my own time? I'd say a couple of things. One is, our jury of 12 over here is still going to bring to the jury room with them this somewhat antiquated notion of, there's a work day, and then there's stuff that you do kind of after work, right? And we're going to call, because the evidence has generally suggested, the work day is till 6 o'clock, right? And everything that they were doing was after work. Point noted that there's never an after work. But I think that that's at least a safe zone, weekends, etc. Again, recognizing the realities that you're always working, I think that's how you have to make some sense of what the statutory restrictions are. Herb.
What do you recommend to an entrepreneur who, say, is working for a company like Microsoft, very large entity, and working in one particular area, operating systems, and comes up with a great idea for an application? So something completely outside of his or her own area, but within the company's general line of business. Wants to leave, wants to be upfront about it, wants to start the new company.
when they come to me, first thing I say is you're going to have a lot of problems convincing your investors that you're clean. Entrepreneur says, well, what can I do to fix that?
Okay, when this California Labor Code provision is, I've been intrigued enough by the provision that I've actually waded through hundreds of pages of legislative history on it, most of which is not particularly helpful on what these words actually mean. But one of the amendments that was actually proposed, sorry, these are reverting to legislative intents and stuff, was simply they wanted to change this to, in this language that deals with anticipated development or research of the company, et cetera. They wanted to change the statute in a way that actually narrowed the construction of the statute to the business with which you are affiliated, right? In other words, the question back there was, I have a job description, it's job description A, right? What if my development is is outside of my job description, outside of my operating unit? That proposed change was not accepted. It was rejected, right? And by the way, coincidentally, the letters that are written in opposing it are by, yes, you guessed it, all big companies, right? No, we want an expansive definition of what constitutes our business, right? So, the best advice is, to the extent possible, you make a break. You have a clean break. If that's not possible, it goes back to what I said with regard to the job description A hypothetical, which is you got to be prepared to assume some risk associated with it and do everything else. Don't take trade secrets, be very upfront with your employer in returning everything to minimize the risk associated with the fact that you're doing something that your employer may very well claim is related to the business. In defense of companies and employers, especially here in the Valley, I think they're pretty reasonable about those kinds of things, because otherwise we'd be absolutely flooded with litigation. I mean, flooded with litigation over employers taking the position that what NewCo is doing relates to our business, and the founder of NewCo must have been, working on these matters with us, and lawsuits over these kinds of issues, you have the obligation to sign. It's just simply not the case. Yes, you hear about the big, Oracle, Siemens type, disputes, or, Apple, Siemens, et cetera, over patents and things like that. But, and look, I make my living with trade secret cases, right? I mean, I represent a lot of companies on both sides of trade secret disputes and stuff. So yes, there's a lot of litigation, but surprisingly, there is not a great deal of litigation on this precise issue that we're talking about with regard to invention assignments. And frankly, in the history of the statute, there are probably fewer than 25 cases that even touch on the statute, most of which are totally uninsightful in terms of what the statute means. Yes, question?
So other than not just taking the plunge and leaving your current employer, what are some of the more common mistakes that you see entrepreneurs inadvertently making?
Being totally oblivious. And maybe it's because in business school they don't really talk about these kinds of things, or it maybe actually it's more probable that someone did talk about it in business school as opposed to the situation that most entrepreneurs are in, which is they never went to business school, whatever, they went to, they're engineers or whatever, and they're just simply oblivious to what this landscape is. So they go along whistling in the wind, using their company laptops, meeting in conference rooms at the company and doing all kinds of things, which to the employer is going to look like, real strong indicia that this was done on company time. So number one, you got to understand the landscape that you're playing on, as I mentioned earlier, right? What do your agreements say against the backdrop of the statute that says you basically owe everything to the employer and you're obligated to assign things that relate to the business of the company, what kinds of things can we do to ensure that we keep our nose clean, right? I mean, when I go after small companies and stuff like that on behalf of employers, lots of companies essentially do a restart. We're going back to the clean room, right? Just so that our employer can't lay claim on these things. And they're doing it in a way that is more mindful and respectful of the fact that a company has a lot of rights and may choose to assert them. So this talk was basically how to avoid some of the hassles, right? And knowledge is really important in terms of how to avoid some of the hassles and taking some of the basic steps. What I don't want you to take away from this is that it's impossible to start a company. Not true. We form thousands of companies, right? People are doing what we're talking about every day of the week, right? And they're forming companies and they're navigating all these areas and they're choosing to take the risks associated with doing so, right? Even while working with their current employers. The message is simply, look, be smart about it. Fine, you're smart people, be smart about it. Understand what the risks are. Understand what your obligations are. Understand what risks you can and cannot take. And do what you can do, what's in your control, to actually conduct yourself in a way that our jury of 12 over here is going to say was honorable and sure doesn't look like they were doing anything to steal the company's inventions or trade secrets and stuff. And if you do some of those things, you're well on your way just to avoiding some of the hassles that can result when you're more reckless in doing that.
Well, we promised everybody to get you out so you can go watch the space shuttle or actually go to work. And we're actually past time, so I apologize for that. But Rico, thank you very much for agreed to talk for a little bit more and one-on-one type things. I think we're going to move right now down to the faculty lounge at the other end of the building. And as I said, I'll be around for as long as you guys want to talk on other topics. So thank you very much for coming. We'll see you in 3 weeks.